Hi, everybody. This is Chris Katolka, and I'm host of the Friends of Israel Today radio program. I cannot tell you how glad that we're all here together and that we can be a part of this amazing event this afternoon. Now, if you're just joining us for the very first time, maybe this is your first interaction with the Friends of Israel, welcome. Thank you for being with us. Let me just give you a brief history of the Friends of Israel. We were founded in 1938 by Christian businessmen, women, and pastors who really saw a need. In 1938, Hitler's hand was suffocating the Jewish people in Eastern Europe, and these Bible-believing Christians acted. They started raising funds in churches in order to reach out and to help these beleaguered Jewish people. And by raising funds, we were able to help bring some freedom and liberation during this very difficult time in Jewish history. And ever since then, the Friends of Israel has been proactive in investing spiritually and practically in the Jewish communities all around the world to show and share the love of the Messiah Jesus, and also to educate the church about the importance of Israel and the Jewish people from a biblical perspective. And that is why, to me, this event is so important. This event matters. Today, Steve Herzig is our host. Steve Herzig is the director of North American Ministries here at the Friends of Israel. He's also the author of Jewish Culture and Customs. He will be interviewing our guest today, Joel Rosenberg. Joel Rosenberg is a New York Times best-selling author. He is also the CEO and founder of the Joshua Fund. Now listen, if maybe at some point you need to get off during this meeting, please don't, but if you do have to, it's going to be recorded. You'll be able to go back to it and watch it again, or this is something that you'll even be able to share with your friends on Facebook, on any social media platform, so it will be available to you, so be sure to look out for that. Go to foi.org to find out more information about the Friends of Israel. This is really going to be a great event as Joel Rosenberg gives us some insights as to what's going on in Israel and really what the scriptures have to say about the last days and what they mean for us. It's going to be an exciting and informative hour. Thank you for joining us and enjoy. Steve?
Thanks, Chris, and thank you for coming. Joel, thank you for coming.
Great to be here. Well, I didn't come anywhere, but I'm glad to be with you guys from Jerusalem.
Yeah, this COVID thing has certainly driven us all crazy, but it's forced us to do some creative things, and this is one of them. So we want to thank you for being here with us. I want to start off right away with questions to put you to work. And first question is, you know, in America, you're very familiar with elections, national elections. Every 4 years, we have elections, and we can tell because of all the commercials that go on TV. But that's nothing compared to what Israel's been going through in the last 2 years. In 2 years, you've had 4 elections, and there's the possibility, Joel, of a 5th one. I'd like you to comment on what's the feeling of the Israelis during this time?
Well, Steve, we are, of course, a nation that prides ourselves that we are the only, certainly the most real and robust democracy in all of the Middle East, and but I think this is taking it a little far to basically have an election every 6 months is something that's pretty extraordinary. I mean, Steve, my wife and I have been citizens of Israel now, dual U.S. Israeli citizens, for 7 years. Okay, we voted 5 times. Now, I have a dear Palestinian Christian brother. He's in his 70s. I had lunch with him last year, just before the whole COVID lockdown. He's voted once in his entire life, and we voted 5 times in 7 years. So, Israelis are unbelievably frustrated by this. It is not happening because the country is, has some desire to keep going back to elections. They're expensive. They're annoying. The problem is there is not a resolution. The country is divided almost exactly down the middle. I wouldn't say between left and right. The main argument over the last 4 rounds of elections is not between left and right in Israel, the way you would think of it in an American context. The issue here is between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is doing a great job. He's got flaws, but we need him in the cockpit as this plane goes through turbulent times. That's half the country. But the other half of the country says either he's a terrible pilot or he's been good in the past, but he's lost his way, and now we need to remove him from the cockpit and put in somebody else who can take us forward. Netanyahu is the longest serving prime minister in the history of the modern state of Israel. That's no small feat. The original was David Ben-Gurion, the founder of the country. So Netanyahu has huge strengths. There's no question about it. And I'll just wrap up because I could go on and on. But think of just what's happened in the last several years under Netanyahu's watch. And I say these as positives. He persuaded President Donald Trump to recognize that Jerusalem, where I'm speaking to you from now, where my home is, where we purchased an apartment, is in fact the eternal and indivisible capital of the Jewish people in the state of Israel. He persuaded Trump then to move the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He persuaded Trump to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He persuaded Netanyahu persuaded Trump to withdraw from the dangerously flawed Iran nuclear deal, to impose a maximum pressure campaign against the genocidal apocalyptic leaders in Tehran. I'll give you one more, but that's pretty good. He persuaded, or let's say negotiated with Trump's help, not one, not two, not three, but 4 historic, game-changing, mind-defying Arab-Israeli peace treaties, the Abraham Accords. For any other leader at any other time, this would result in landslide victories. But much of the political sphere believes that that's all true. I haven't gone through the list of things that people are frustrated about. I will if you want. But the point is, there's tremendous frustration with Netanyahu here. And even those who are his allies historically, many of them are breaking away from him.
Well, you need the wisdom of Solomon in order to determine and prognosticate what might happen. But what you just said, Joel, I think really is helpful for the next question. And I think it's really important, especially for those in the United States. Most of our listeners are from there listening. You know, looking at the Middle East today, it is different. 70 years plus of history in Israel, and it's changed. And you just outlined those changes through the last administration. But things are topsy-turvy here. We have a brand new administration. We have the country has voted, and I know our listeners might argue as to about the vote and all that. All I know is we have a new administration. And that new administration is completely different in its views than the previous one. How do the Israelis, how do you think they're thinking about the Joe Biden administration and the implications? Will they honor what's been happening? What do you think is the trend?
There's a number of different ways to look at that, Steve. I think the simplest way to look at it is there is cautious pessimism.
I like that.
By that I mean that Joe Biden has known more Israeli leaders personally, face to face, than anybody in Washington, anybody else. I mean, the man has been around for a half a century. He personally knew Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir. Okay, Netanyahu didn't know Golda Meir. Benny Gantz, our defense minister, didn't know. Nobody here in a high-ranking position, except for maybe our president, Rudy Rivlin, knew one of the founding mothers of the country. So when you think of so that's one thing, is that Biden has a long history. It's a very positive history with Israel and with the Jewish community. Biden openly describes himself as a Zionist. That's not a term that most Gentile people, use unless they're a very devout evangelical, or, he's from a Catholic background. You don't have a history of people saying, I'm a proud Zionist. So, and he's also just a warm, friendly person. And so he has a warm relationship. Even with Netanyahu, he once famously scribbled a signature on a picture of the two of them, Netanyahu and Biden. Biden wrote, "Bibi, I love you, even though I don't agree with one darn thing that you ever, that you stand for, or something to that effect." And I'm bleeping one of the words. So, but there's a warmth. There's a warmth that Barack Obama, the previous president before Trump, he did not have this. It was a train wreck. But the problem that Israelis have, whether they know this quote or not, essentially what Israelis worry about is the quote or the sentiment expressed by former defense secretary in the Biden administration, in the Obama administration, by former defense secretary Bob Gates. Gates said, I love Joe Biden. If the guy's, fabulous. He's warm, he's friendly. If I ever had a crisis in my life, he's who I would call. But when it comes to foreign policy, Joe Biden has been wrong on every foreign policy issue for the last 40 years. That's from a friend. That's from a senior official in the Obama-Biden administration. And so this is a conundrum. Israelis don't want to panic, but Trump was so, whatever else you thought about him, he had huge positive ratings here in Israel because of what he did. Not because of every tweet and every controversy, but because the man just proved himself. He loved Israel and was willing to stand with us in every possible way. We've never seen an American president be so pro-Israel as Donald Trump. You can say whatever else you want about him. I was a never Trumper, just for context, in the 2016 campaign. I will just say, I know this is not a partisan thing, just so people have context, where my cards, I was against him. But I did ultimately hold my nose and vote for him. But I was cautiously pessimistic, almost aggressively pessimistic.
I think you were like a lot of people. I think you were a lot of people felt that way.
In the end, I actually was invited to meet with him in the Oval Office. And in that meeting, I told him the story. And I said, look, I was against you. I voted for you super reluctantly. But in the end, you will go down in history as the most pro-life, but also the most pro-Israel president in the history of the United States of America. And that's pretty good. And I walked him through all the reasons why. So Israelis are worried. And they don't like where Biden is heading on Iran. They don't like the fact that Biden didn't even call Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu for more than a month after taking the oath of office. So there are concerns, but nobody wants to hit the panic button yet because Biden is historically so friendly. I don't think he means it. I don't think he intends his policies to be harmful to Israel, but sometimes they have been.
Do Israelis have confidence that Joe Biden is the person? Is there any talk, as I've heard just scuttlebutt around when I travel, that there's somebody else, some other group that makes the decision and he kind of goes along? Have you heard, do the Israelis talk that way at all?
No, I'm not hearing anything serious, either in terms of him being illegitimately put in office, the whole controversy from January 6th and so forth, or that he's not in command. Now, there's a general concern about him overall. Is nice guy, but is he up for it?
Yep.
Yeah, but whether he's actually in charge, I don't think that's the question right now.
Good.
But I do think there's a concern, and I would add one other thing. Vice President Kamala Harris is not a known quantity here. She has been here when she was elected a senator, but she's not even served a full Senate term. So there's a concern about her. Now she's married to a Jewish man. And she has Jewish stepchildren who call her Mamala instead of Kamala, right? So,
yeah.
So that's an interesting story because because Biden, to his credit, has pushed back against the crazies in the Democratic Party who are hostile to Israel, who want to defund Israel. I mean, if you look at, even someone like Senator Bernie Sanders, whose family, he has family that died in the Holocaust, right? He's Jewish, but he is hostile I'm just sorry. I'm sorry it's true, but it's true. He's hostile to Israel. He's called even this week for cutting military funding to Israel and so forth. So, and there are others, obviously, the young women now that are, very pro-Palestinian, very hostile to Israel, borderline anti-Semitic, some maybe not so borderline. So Biden has pushed back against that, to his credit. And in bringing in Kamala Harris, we don't actually know what she really believes. We do know she's married to someone Jewish, so there's not an immediate reflexive sense that she's hostile. But again, you could be Jewish and hostile to Israel as
absolutely. In fact,
one other point, and I hope it's a takeaway for people, again, just to keep context. Biden was one of the architects of the Iran nuclear deal. So in my view, that was very bad. Biden takes pride in the fact that he persuaded President Obama to pull all U.S. forces out of Iraq in 2011, which created the very vacuum that everybody, including Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, told them it would, which created ISIS. So, which led to genocide, right? So these are very bad things. But I will say one other positive thing for Biden, and that is this: he was very active in promoting the U.S. congressional funding of Israel's Iron Dome anti-rocket defense system. And he's a huge proponent of it. It happened during the Obama-Biden years, and it has saved countless Israeli lives, mine own included. I've been under Iron Domes when I've watched them shoot rockets from Gaza out of the sky, and I was standing right there. So I just think we always need fairness, right? Just like if you're pro-Trump, you realize how badly he was treated, that not everything that was said or alleged against him was true. We have to have the same perspective towards Biden, even if we have criticisms. But, the main thing is to be praying. I told President Trump that once he took the Oval Office, I prayed for him every single day, for him, for his wife, for his family, for his team. And I'm doing the same for Vice President Biden and, of course, for President Biden and Vice President Harris.
As well, we should. Just a note, President Biden is a Jewish grandfather. He's not Jewish, but he has Jewish grandchildren. And
great point.
So it is important biblically that we remember to pray for those in authority over us. So I appreciate that. Joel, you mentioned Iran, and that segues really nicely to the explosion that took place at the Natanz nuclear facility in Iran. There's tension. I know as a Jewish person and as an evangelical in support of Israel for years now, I have felt personally the tension in Iran, and sometimes with my Jewish background, I might worry more than I should, but I do. What's the reaction to that explosion in Natanz, and where do you see this going?
Well, this goes back to two other points, and it links in together, Steve. The first is what Netanyahu, for all of his critics, what he's doing right. Remember that one of the things he did a few years ago was order the Israeli Secret Service, the CIA of Israel, known as the Mossad, to sneak into Tehran and steal the entire nuclear weapons archive of the Iranian government. And they did it. It should become a movie someday.
I remember that. It was amazing.
It's a thriller, which I wish I had written. It's unbelievable. We have the entire archive. They just, tons of material. The same thing is true with Natanz. We don't know precisely if Israel was responsible, but Israel doesn't seem to be denying it. In a rare moment, there are a lot of hints coming out of Jerusalem that, Israel was totally responsible for this explosion that took out the power supply for Iran's main uranium enrichment facility that is enriching uranium, heading towards the capacity to build weapon-grade, uranium to build nuclear weapons, warheads. And apparently, if the news reports are to be believed, the devastation is so bad that it's really set back the Iranian program. I don't know for sure. But that would be another, evidence that that Israel, and under Netanyahu, but Israel is not waiting around for the United States or any international power to figure out how to stop Iran from getting the bomb. Israel feels that we want the United States to figure out a way. We're not happy with the Biden decision to go back into negotiations and possibly go back into the same nuclear deal that Israelis feel was so flawed and so dangerous and so hostile to our interests, and that economic sanctions might be lifted right at a moment, Steve, where a new International Monetary Fund study shows that the foreign currency reserves in Iran have dropped from 123 billion down to 4 billion.
Wow.
Because of the economic sanctions that the Trump administration, the maximum pressure campaign that they imposed. I actually did an interview today for our news site here, All Israel News, and we have a sister site, All Arab News. It'll show next week. We'll post it next week. But I interviewed former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo just before this call, and so I can just tell you, I'm not going to give away too much of that interview, but I'll just tell you that interview plus my recent interview with the defense minister here in Israel, Benny Gantz, and others is convincing me that Israeli leaders are deeply worried. I mean, they're trying to be very careful with their language with Biden, but they are worried that Iran is about to, the train is leaving the station towards a full-on nuclear weapons program. And maybe Iran is doing all these provocative moves, enriching to 20%, which they were only supposed to enrich till 3.5%, but now they want to do 20%. Now they're saying 60% they're already doing. This is very dangerous. And Israel is taking actions, apparently, and not waiting for negotiations to work. And I think that's telling us that here's the headline off of this riff. Do not stop praying for the peace of Jerusalem just because Israel and 4 Arab neighbors made historic and wonderful and so encouraging peace treaties last year. The threat has not gone away. Those are countries that we're very happy to have peace with and normalization, but they weren't threats to us. Iran is more dangerous today than at any other time.
Hey, I really appreciate that, and being nervous, as I said, about Iran is not just because I'm Jewish, but because I'm an evangelical. And those of us that hold to the scriptures realize that there's 2 chapters in the scripture, Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39, very familiar chapters, I might add, for you. You've written extensively about them in lots of different areas, and that's where I want to segue here now, is to talk to you a little bit about Gog and Magog, and talk to us in reference to what you just said about Iran and how concerned Israel is. That's the secular aspect. That's what's going on. But biblically, you have an extensive knowledge and understanding and an opinion. We're Jewish. We have opinions. You get 2 of us, you get 3. So I want to hear your opinion and your educated and theological perspective as to Ezekiel 38 and 39 and how it segues to what you just discussed.
Happy to do it, Steve. I'm going to do my best to keep my opinion out of this, though obviously I put my cards on the table. I'm not a fully impartial person. I have strong views, and I'll explain why. Let me just walk through some of the elements of this prophecy, which many of your viewers and readers may be familiar with, but we really need to become familiar with these passages today. Because some things are happening in recent years, recent weeks, that suggest that we may be closer to the fulfillment of the war of Gog and Magog than we realize. Now, I'm not saying that we are. That's where I want to be careful about injecting my opinion, like who really cares what Joel thinks, are we, aren't we? But I will tell you that I caution believers all over the world, wherever I speak, and in all my writing, we need to do what Jesus told us to do in Luke chapter 12. You know, he's like, look, you watch the Weather Channel. Well, he didn't say Weather Channel, but he was like, look, you know when it's windy, or when it's and it's a hot wind blowing, it's going to be a hot day. Like, it's not rocket science. Again, paraphrasing. Encourage people to look at it in Luke chapter 12. But you know that when it's red sky in the morning, sailors take warning. Red sky at night, sailors are like, all right. He didn't say it quite that way, but the point is, he's basically saying, you guys analyze the earth and the sky. You because you're farmers, because it's an agrarian society. The weather is important to your day-to-day life and your livelihoods. You hypocrites, why do you not analyze these present times? Now, what the Messiah was saying at the time was, there's a whole list of prophecies about when the Messiah comes, what would you be looking for? And you guys aren't connecting the dots. You're not taking the list and going, oh, look at that. He was born in Bethlehem. Oh, not just Bethlehem in the north, not Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He was born in Bethlehem, Judea, in Ephrata. Oh my gosh, that's interesting. How many people are from that little village? Not that many. Was he born of a virgin? Oh, yes, he was. How many people from Bethlehem, Judea, Ephrata have been born of a virgin? Not that many. So, and as you started to go through, Jesus is basically saying, are you paying any attention to the messianic prophecies in the scriptures? You already sense in the first century that the Messiah is coming, and he's coming soon. John the Baptist is telling you he's coming soon. Hello? Now, okay, so that's the same approach we need to take to prophecy, which is, what does the text actually tell us? What are the things that are watchable, that are knowable? And then what's happening in our world? Are we analyzing the present times in which we live from a biblical worldview, from a what I call the third lens of Scripture, particularly prophecy? And so on that note, I'll just say this. If you look at Ezekiel 36, 37, and then into 38, what are you looking at? You're looking at a series of prerequisites prior to this big Gog and Magog war. And the Gog and Magog war is Russia and Iran and Turkey and a group of other countries building an alliance surrounding Israel and coming to attack us in what the Bible calls, quote, the last days, unquote, and that the attack will largely come from the north. Okay? That's the word Gog and Magog. Okay? Now, what are the prerequisites? Well, Israel has to be reborn as a sovereign nation state. Check. Mm-hmm. Jews have to be returning and resettling in the land of Israel. I think you can check it. I'm not saying that all Jews are here. You're still, obviously, in New Jersey or wherever you are right now. Like, okay, so we're not all back yet. And I joke with Israelis, look, when 5 million American Jews come back, like, that's going to be a lot of traffic problems. You think we have problems now? Housing prices are high now to get an apartment. Wait till all the American Jews come. Okay. But still, it's extraordinary. Here I am talking from Jerusalem. One of the prerequisites in the text tells us that the Jews will be rebuilding the ancient ruins. Well, that's happening. I'm not saying these are fulfilled, but they're being filled. Maybe they're not fulfilled. Maybe they're not going to be fulfilled, which is on the full, for hundreds more years in God's economy. But look at what's happening. That's the setup. And then Israel has to be prosperous. There's no question Israel is more prosperous today than any other time since Solomon, right? We have natural gas, massive quantities of natural gas off our borders. We have a Silicon Wadi, right, instead of a Silicon Valley. We've got most of the stuff that's made in your phone or in your computer or your high-tech stuff was built or designed or invented in Israel. Something big is happening here, but also Israel's feeling secure. Yes, Iran's a threat. And there are other threats. But at the same time, Israel does have a strategic relationship and alliance with America, the world's only superpower. We do have F-35 stealth fighter jets that can slip into our enemy countries without even being seen. We have submarines parked, lurking right off the coast of Iran right now as you and I speak. They have missiles that are not going to leave an insignificant scar on the Iranian regime and its military facilities if they have to be used. They're parked right there and waiting. We have peace treaties with Egypt, with Jordan, and now with 4 other countries. So Israelis, it's a conundrum, right? Two things are true at once. Israel is the most targeted country on the planet, and Iran is becoming more dangerous than ever. I just said that. And yet, Israelis feel more secure than we ever have. We're Jews. We get that people hate us, and they want to kill us, and they want to annihilate us. That's not new. You go back to, Haman trying to say we're going to annihilate the Jewish people, or the Pharaoh, and right up to Hitler, and right up to, the Ahmad genocide, Mahmoud Ahmad genocide in his day, the president of Iran, and now the mullahs in Iran. Look, people hate us, they want to destroy us, but yet God is favoring us. This is exactly the dynamic, Steve, that the Bible speaks of that would be in motion before this Russian-Iranian-Turkish alliance happens. And now, in the last 20 years, particularly in the last 10 years, even particularly in the last few years, Russia, Iran, Turkey are forming an alliance. That is not normal. It hasn't happened in the 2,600 years since Ezekiel wrote the prophecy, but it's happening now. Now, one curveball, I'll just give you one, and then I'll stop because I don't, now I'm giving a sermon, so I don't mean that. But one country that's interesting is the country in the prophecy of Cush. Now, historically, a lot of English translations of Ezekiel 38 will describe Cush, will translate it as Ethiopia. And it's certainly true that Ethiopia is part of what ancient Cush was. But ancient Cush is really the country we would today call Sudan. Now, when I wrote a book called Epicenter 15 years ago, which really goes into these prophecies and what was happening then, 15 years ago, it looks, wow, things are really moving. The trajectories are so interesting and compelling that we're getting closer to the fulfillment of this prophecy. But at the time, I said, well, Sudan, that's interesting because Sudan is a country that's a radical jihadist country aligned with Iran. When President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad wanted to give a speech talking about destroying the evil cancer of Israel, he gave it in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. Sudan has a military relationship, buying weapons from Russia. So at that time, 15 years ago, it seemed like, well, I can see Sudan being in a coalition against Israel. But today, Sudan has just signed a peace treaty with Israel. So it's actually moved us back slightly from the brink. And it's interesting what's going to happen there. Turkey, when I wrote the book 15 years ago, was a friend of Israel. And Israelis took cheap vacations by flying up to Antalya and other coastal cities in Turkey. It's beautiful. I've done it. It's just a gorgeous country. But in the last few years, under President Recep Erdogan, the Turkish president, he is taking them to the dark side, hostile to Israel. And yet, this week, now he's talking about maybe lightening up a little bit on Israel and maybe Egypt. So let me stop there. I'm happy to talk more about it, but there are things that are happening that are very consistent with the prophecies. There are some things that are happening that are not consistent with the prophecies.
I think that's helpful. I think that's helpful. It is a conundrum, and I think you pointed some things out that will be helpful for our people. Joel, the next question I want to ask you is personal, and it's going to really center on your journey that you and your family made as Jewish believers. You made Aliyah. That means you ascended. That means you went to Israel, immigrated from the United States to Israel. That's where you live now. You're talking to us from Jerusalem. But before we do that, Joel, I was talking yesterday to you in preparation for this meeting, and you commented something really significant to me and to those of us with Friends of Israel, and that is the impact that Friends of Israel has actually made on you and your family. Can you comment about that? How Friends of Israel has impacted you and your family?
Well, I appreciate it. I wouldn't say that the impact has been direct. What I would say is that Friends of Israel is a ministry that we have been so encouraged by. The staff that we know personally and well and respect deeply. These are really wonderful believers that whose heart and whose fruit is really being borne out as they care for, they love, as they minister to Jewish people, particularly here in the land of Israel. So much so that we've been so encouraged by the Friends of Israel ministry that we are financial supporters, and have been for a number of years. So well, it's not a direct impact, but it is an impact that encourages us because, a lot of ministries in the world today, they will describe that they love Israel and they will provide political support and all kinds of enthusiastic support for Israel, but they're not willing to get involved in telling Jewish people that our Messiah has come, or helping young new believers in Jesus from a Jewish background to walk and grow in their faith. And that's a shame because more Jews are coming to faith in Jesus as Messiah in the last 20 or 30 years than in the last 20 centuries. And that's true in America. There are now 871,000 Jewish followers of Jesus. That's an extraordinary number. We did a research project that Joshua Fund helped fund a few years ago with the Southern Baptists. That's an amazing concept. Almost 900,000 Jewish evangelicals in the United States alone. Here we've gone from 23 Jewish followers of Jesus in 1948, 23, some of whom I still know. I know them personally. It's like knowing believers off the Mayflower or something. But we've gone from 23 Jewish followers of Jesus here in Israel to 30,000, according to the Israel College of the Bible Study just a few years ago. That's growth. That's tremendous. And what we need today are ministries like Friends of Israel that are not ashamed of the gospel, knowing that it is the power of God for salvation to the Jew first, but not only to the Jew, but obviously to the Greek as well, to the Gentiles. So I'm encouraged. That's what excites us, and that's why we're grateful for the Friends of Israel ministry.
I'm thankful to hear that. And, just like you, our staff has touched people who really don't know that much about the organization, but they know our staff. And that includes you. And really, when our staff touches someone, it's really Friends of Israel that touches them as well. And, since 1942, Israel My Glory has been a publication that we've used to really help people understand what God is saying. And the Friends of Israel reaches out and has influence in the Christian world through our award-winning magazine. That's Israel My Glory. And this particular issue, the power of the gospel that you've heard Joel talking about today, if you want to keep up to the trends that impact Israel and the Christian world, I want to encourage you to get a one-year free subscription to Israel My Glory. You can do that simply going to israelmyglory.org/subscribe. There you can subscribe and receive 6 free issues. Yep, we're giving it to you free, either digitally or in print. That it's going to keep you informed as to the events that are happening in Israel, biblical teaching, all about the Jewish people. And again, head to israelmyglory.org/subscribe. And we'll thank you, really thank you, for doing so. Well, Joel, that gets back to that question that I wanted to ask you. As a Jewish believer who came to faith in Jesus, you were born in America, raised in America, you started your career in America, but now the Rosenbergs live in Israel. And that's such an encouragement to me. I know through the years, Jewish believers have had a difficult time, some being denied opportunity to live in Israel. And I am fascinated by the fact that you, such a well-known person, look, I remember your work at Epicenter and you talking to Benjamin Netanyahu and saying, I need to tell you something. Before I work for you, you need to know where I stand. And then Netanyahu, as you described it, just said, oh, look, you think you'd be here if I didn't know that? And anyway, I just thought that was an interesting thing. Describe for us.
Just to be clear, that was to one of his senior advisors, not to him directly, but yes, it's true that I had an opportunity to work for him 20-some years ago, and as a believer. And now I wasn't as known then. I was not a published author. I was not preaching and teaching and all over the world. I wasn't. But my faith was real, and it was amazing that a once and future Prime Minister of Israel would hire.
But then you made it to Israel. When you did make it to Israel as a believer, they knew about you. And that to me was the fascinating part. Can you tell us a little bit about that 7 years ago you made the journey? the adjustments that you've had to make. Can you comment about that?
Yeah, unfortunately, personally, it's been the 7 fat years. Emotionally, at times it has been the 7 lean years. It's a challenge. Look, I meet Jewish believers who have been denied or fear being denied the right to emigrate into Israel and make Aliyah. And it's very painful. And they ask me, what is your secret? And I don't have a secret. I mean, there was no secret. We applied. We wrote a cover letter that says, we're evangelicals. We didn't want to hide it. I'm pretty high profile, so, I'm pretty Googleable, Steve, so there was no point in hiding it. In fact, for me, it was sort of like that cover letter to the application was sort of like Elijah, pouring gallons of water on the sacrifice. Like, if it lights, it's God. Nobody's going to give the Rosenberg any credit, and we don't deserve any. The Lord, in a still small voice, called us to come. Mid-career, teenagers, not a convenient time to sell your home, do Genesis 12, leave your home, leave your father's house, and go to the land I will show you. Now it was easier for us in the sense that we had, a plane to take us there, we had, but we had phones and Waze, which is the GPS system. But it's difficult. So God just did it sovereignly. He doesn't. There's nothing. Job 42 tells us that nothing can thwart His will. If God wants you in this country, under any visa setup or under citizenship, He will do it. Nobody can thwart that. We have to trust the God of Israel. If He's calling us in, He's going to make a way. So there's no secret for us. Now, we had some good counsel. Right? We tried not to do things that were foolish. But I think the larger point is, having come here, having brought our kids many times, they love Israel, but it was hard, Steve. Americans mostly don't make Aliyah, right? Most
Very
Jews
difficult.
who move to Israel, they are coming from countries where they are in danger, or they perceive themselves to be in current or not too far from now danger. And so when they hit the hard moments, which there are many in this country, more than we have time for, it's cross-cultural, it's food, it's relationships, it's politics, it's trying to get, a driver's license. You cannot even believe how hard things are. It's just, you're like, how's a people this bright, how do they have systems that are so messed up? It's unbelievable. Nevertheless, when you hit those moments, relationally or structurally, bureaucratically, whatever, legally, financially, if you're from Yemen, you're like, well, thank God I'm not in Yemen. Thank God I'm not in Ukraine where they're beating the snot out of me. Okay, we're here, we're safe, but it's hard. Okay. Americans don't think that way.
That's true.
When you leave the world's wealthiest, most powerful country on the face of the planet in the history of mankind, where everything's been made to be as easy as possible, and you come to Israel, a developing country, a mixed, between East and West, it is not easy. and it hasn't been easy for us. But it's what we're supposed to be doing. We see fruit. We're so glad. We're grateful. But it's hard. And I don't want to kid anybody. It's not for the faint of heart. And therefore, I don't try to go out and persuade people to make Aliyah. It's between you and the Lord. When the Lord, He's got a timing. When he's ready to call you, say yes. We have a son named Jonah. We have 4 sons. You name your kid Jonah, and he calls you to Israel, you really shouldn't get on a Disney cruise and go in the other direction. You sort of, you sort of made your bed, and it's now time to lie in it. You can't, you need to learn the lessons. So don't resist God.
That's a great encouragement. In fact, for those people who might not be familiar with Jonah, go read the book, and you'll know what Joel was speaking about. Another question, Joel, that you and I, there's a relationship that we both have. That is, we're Jewish, and we believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And when I told my parents, I come from an Orthodox background, when I told my parents, I need to tell you, there was pushback, big time pushback. But I can honestly say that I never got pushback from our culture, the American culture. It wasn't like I became a believer and now there are things that are going to happen to me and all that. But now you're in Israel as a Jewish believer. What kind of pushback do you get? And I want to put another question, if I can put two questions in one. When you get that pushback, I can tell by your zeal here that you've had opportunity to share your faith. And usually, for those of us, especially those of us who are Jewish, we go to the fifth gospel, that is Isaiah chapter 53. So I'd like to hear what kind of pushback you get in Israel and what kind of opportunities have you had, and do they involve Isaiah 53?
Well, Steve, I get a lot of opportunities. And I think I'm not normal in the sense that because of who I am and my profile, if I get invited to meet with a government minister or the president of Israel or cabinet ministers or members of Knesset or business leaders or whatever, any meeting that requires an appointment, somebody's Googled me. They've made a decision whether they want to meet with me or not. And if I clear that, the TSA, the Transportation Safety Administration, you get on the plane, if I clear the TSA system, at least that they are willing to be in a room with me, sometimes they don't want it known. Sometimes they really want an off-the-record meeting just to get to know each other, and I'm happy to do that. Sometimes, I'm interviewing them for our new, news site, All Israel News, or some other context, but they have Googled me, so they know. So this provides all kind of freedom and curiosity, right? There's not that many Jewish believers in Jesus here in Israel who have, who are New York Times best-selling authors, or are on Fox News or other, Christian Broadcast News or whatever, a lot, or who have been invited to lead 6 evangelical delegations to Arab countries to meet with the most senior Arab and Muslim leaders in the region, in the world, including the next king of Saudi Arabia. I've had that opportunity because God has opened those doors. And when somebody Googles me, they have questions. I have questions for them, but they have questions for me. So it's not that difficult to bring up Jesus and talk about him. And some really do want that conversation. Some are willing to have it. Some want it. I would say that when you just meet people in the street or your neighbors or whatever, yeah, that's a little more fluid, but it's also intriguing to them. It doesn't take long before they're like, "You guys are Americans. You're here. Why? What's it?" What you're talking about, really, the more classic case, are my boys. That we have 4 sons, and 2 of them have completed their or served in the army. One served his full term. One did what he needed to do, and then he was able to leave. That's pretty amazing. One of them served in an elite combat unit. Now, when you're an American Jewish teenager or young 20s, and you get drafted into the Israeli army as a believer, you have no place to hide. You're either going to crumble in your faith, or you're going to have a million opportunities, because they literally break you out on Shabbat. The guys who are religious, meaning Jewish religious, the way you grew up, they don't have to go. They don't have to work in the kitchen. So they ask you right at the beginning, are you religious or you're non-religious? Okay, so what do you say as a Jewish believer? No, by your definition, I'm not dati, religious, or haredi, ultra-Orthodox. No, I'm not that. So oh, you're secular, you're Hiloni. Well, no, I believe in God. I believe. So everybody sees. These are small units. Everybody knows who you are, and they're asking. And if you're going to have a quiet time, I'll tell you one quick story. One of my sons was he was in this combat unit, and his commander said, "So are you religious or not religious?" He's like, "Well, so he had he told him." So it's like, Well, what does that mean? The commander didn't know what to say. The commander's only 21 or 22, right? So he says, well, do you want, on Saturday, do you want to go to the synagogue? Or I mean, daily, do daily prayers. Are you going to the synagogue or are you not going to the synagogue? No, not really, but don't you spend time reading the Bible and praying? Well, yes, I do. Well, where do you do that? Well, wherever. All right, look, go to the synagogue, he said, and just sit on the bench outside. Okay. So he does that. Well, then another guy says, well, I want to start studying with you. Okay. Well, then one day, the really religious, guys in the unit come out, and one of them is just hot as a pistol. Like, he's furious. And he's screaming at my son in Hebrew, how dare you, and, just, you can imagine.
Oh, I can imagine.
And the guy who was younger in his faith and struggling, but who wanted to study with my son, Jacob, now the guy's pushing him, and the guy's, the young believer's glasses go flying off, and Jacob's standing in between them, and it becomes like, it almost goes to full-on blows. And these are combat soldiers, right? They're not, you guys are trained to kill people. So eventually, the thing gets broken up, and it's the ultra-religious guy who ended up going to jail. And the commander's saying, this is absolutely, not acceptable. I don't care what you believe or don't believe. We're the Israeli army. You can believe whatever you want. Blah 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 blah. It was like, now that's not normal, but it's changing in the army. There's a lot, and there's this interesting mix between the religious guys and the non-religious guys, and you don't want to side with either. You want to love and be, Yeshua's witness to both, right? I mean,
absolutely.
How do you do that? And yes, you're on a hilltop over Hebron, a radical Palestinian community with a lot of terrorist activity historically. You're holding an M4 automatic weapon in full combat gear, and you've got an all-night vigil on a hill. And your commander is with you. This happened to both of my boys. What do you talk about after the third hour, the fourth hour? Eventually they're going to say, Jesus is going to come up. The Bible is going to come up. Isaiah 53, it's going to come up. And where are you going to go? But as long as you build relationships, the Jewish people do not want to be targeted. They don't want to think that you're coming after their soul. But we're very relational. I think that Christians who talk about targeting Jews, and we got all these strategies. Look, I understand missiology. But missiology is one thing. People are another thing. And nobody wants to be targeted for anything in life. And so we just have to be relational. And that's true in Israel. No, it is legal. Yes, it is legal to stand up on a street corner and just preach. Not that effective. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm not saying nobody will come to faith or hear at least a seed of the gospel. But mostly you're relating to people in your life. And as you do, everything comes up. And Jews are nosy people, so they will not be shy.
Not at all.
What do you believe in and why? And I love that. And I love that my boys have had some very difficult moments, but they've also been asked at times, I'll give you this last thing, both of the boys, multiple times, were asked in various moments in their service, hey, why don't you just, we all get to pick one topic and explain what we think about something on, on a little seminar. Okay, today, Jonah, you're going to speak, or today you're going to speak, Jacob. Well, what do you want me to speak about? Well, why don't you talk about what it means to be a Messianic Jew? What is that?
Isn't that great?
I usually call myself an evangelical, but all right, well, whatever. You're a Jew, you believe in Jesus, whatever. You're here in the army. Tell us. You got the whole hour.
Isn't that great? Listen, our time is running out, and okay. I want to make sure that we advertised and want to make sure we get some questions in. And as Chris is coming here, I'll start you off with a question that already came in before these questions, and that is, you've mentioned it already. You made inroads in the Arab community. Briefly, I know that's hard for both of us to be brief, but as briefly as you can, but at the same time inform. I find this fascinating. You as a Jewish believer, high-profile person, you're now making inroads in the Arab community. Can you just share a little bit about that, and then we have a couple more questions in the remaining time that we have.
Sure, lightning round, super fast. Well, we've been very proactive. We tried to be both with the Israeli Arab community and the Palestinian Arab community, and particularly with Israeli Arab Christians and Palestinian Arab evangelicals, to build friendship, to listen, to not try to get in a big fight over Zionism and this and that, but to just get to know them and love them and serve them. But it's also true that we have prayed, Lord, open doors. Like, I want to go meet King Abdullah of Jordan. Would you, that's a crazy prayer. We call them audacious prayers. The Lord has answered them. Sometimes I think we don't pray crazy enough. The Lord's opened doors. I've met with the King of Jordan 5 times, with the President of Egypt 5 times, with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia 2 times, 2-hour meetings each time. Like, extensive. So God is opening these doors. I've got a book coming out in September called Enemies and Allies, where I explain what happened, and I walk people through what's changed in the last 20 years since 9/11, who are our enemies, and who are our allies, and what happened, how did I get invited to lead believers to meetings with these top leaders all throughout the region. I think it's going to be a very interesting book for people.
That's super. I know about that book. Yesterday when you talked to us, you told us about enemies and allies. And that book, if I'd like you to just, again, briefly, because September 11th is the 20th anniversary. And your book is so timely, I think our listeners would be really interested. That book is, you're planning a September 7th?
Yes.
So, real briefly, again, tell us about it.
Well, Friends of Israel, you're getting a little sneak preview. I literally have not talked publicly about the book Enemies and Allies until today. You can find it on Amazon. You can pre-order it, so I encourage people to do that. But the short version is it's going to look at where are we in our fight with radical Islamism, with Al-Qaeda, with ISIS. What's going on? Just a few years ago, we had genocide going on near our borders from ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and it was horrible. And now it's over. How did we get that? How are we winning? What's been happening? But also this rising Iranian, Russian, Turkish lines. Even if you don't want to look at it prophetically, it's dangerous. I talked to Secretary Mike Pompeo on the record. I talked to Vice President Pence on the record, exclusive interviews. I talked to the Defense Minister of Israel on the record. Like, these are exclusive interviews about the enemies. Then the next section is on the opportunities and the allies. How did the Abraham Accords come about? I was there on the South Lawn of the White House when it was signed. I know the leaders that have made these deals. I have sat with them before they made their deals and then since. And I have the inside story. It's literally the first book of its kind that has exclusive interviews with all these leaders and the story of how it happened. Jared Kushner's writing a book. The former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, writing a book. Mike Pence just signed a $3 million or something, whatever dollar book deal. They'll all tell that story, but I tell it first, and I tell it from the perspective of a follower of Jesus, a Jewish, Israeli, American, dual citizen with 2 sons who serve in the Israeli army. It's not normal, but it's a book that I think your world will find very, very interesting. Well, I better stop there.
Yeah, no, that's great. And for those of you watching, if you go to joelrosenberg.com, you can stay abreast of all those things happening. We want to be able to get that kind of information into our people's hands, as I know you do as well. Well, here's a question that came in, and I'm just seeing it for the first time myself. Do you think the COVID pandemic is a forerunner of what people on earth will experience during the tribulation? Do you have any opinion? You're just hearing that. COVID-19, many people, if you go and Google COVID-19 in the Bible, all kinds of different things come up. And we want to take a common sense approach. And I can tell, and reading your work, you always take a common sense approach. So how do you think COVID-19, our listener wants to know how that kind of fits in. What do you think?
Well, we have been writing a lot about this on our new news site, All Israel News, for basically for evangelicals, believers around the world who aren't, who are furious with media bias, but aren't sure where to go. Where would I find good reporting, plus links to good, important stories that are in other media? All Israel News. Here's the short version. I would say that COVID, I believe, is one of the birth pangs that is spoken of in Luke chapter 21, where it talks about plagues. Okay, you have this massive global moment in the midst of all these other moments, including the rebirth of the state of Israel. This is a birth pang. But birth pangs are indicators that we're heading towards the return of Christ. It doesn't mean that we're there yet, although the rapture could happen at any moment. But, birth pangs, contraction, release. This has been a contraction, and a very, very painful one. It is evocative of the type of government control that will decide where people can go and what they can do and when they can buy and when they can sell. It's not that yet. This is really, I push back against the conspiracy theories that what's happening here are governments inventing some crisis in order to take this control. This is a real crisis. 3 million people have died. More people have died in Israel of COVID than in the last 25 years of war and terror alone, like combined. So it's real. But it's also God's sovereign way of not only sobering people here in a birth pain contraction to get people to think, whatever I'm depending on my own, financially, emotionally, socially, whatever, I need God. Like, it ought to drive us back to the Lord. But it's also it's God's way of getting the systems of the world ready for what eventually is coming. I think that was true of 9/11, right? All the IDs and all the controls that we normally say, I'm not going to let my freedoms be taken away. Well, you want the plane to blow up or don't you? Like, no, I don't. So we say yes to things that are right in the moment, but the trend line is heading toward a place where it's going to be a turnkey operation for the future Antichrist, capital A, capital C, to take over the world. It's going to be a lot easier when that happens because of things like this that have put systems into place. So that's the simplest, fastest way I can put it.
I really appreciate that. And we always have more questions than time. That's always the problem. And
not always. I mean, people could be bored. They could have fallen asleep.
I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the case, Joel. I think it's been a great hour, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate the time that you've given. We really appreciate it. I want our viewers to remember that you can go to joelrosenberg.com and Israel News, all Arab news. The kind of things that our people are so wanting to know are things that you're helping to provide. We certainly do as well. And so it's great to be co-laborers together with you. And I have so appreciated my time with you. And to you, those that joined us today, we both hope that you were encouraged to hear the truth. That's just so important. Joel talked about the scriptures at the beginning. It's so important. We believe the scriptures are the truth, and we've discussed not just practical things, but biblical truth as well. And we want you to learn more about Joel, and again, go to joelrosenberg.com. And if you want to learn more about Friends of Israel Gospel Ministry, we want you to know more about us. I want you to go to foi.org. That's foi.org. Joel, again, I want to say thank you, give you a chance to say thank you to our listeners as well.
Oh, absolutely. I'm honored, Steve, to be with you. Thank you, all of you who are joining in live in this webinar, and those who will watch it in the days and weeks ahead. It's been an honor to answer your questions. I hope that the resources that I'm providing, either through All Israel News, All Arab News, the Joshua Fund, or the books and Twitter, and all the different ways to try to educate and mobilize the church to bless Israel and her neighbors in the name of Jesus. This is the mission, and it's great to be with you guys all today.
Well, you've been a blessing to us, and so have you, those who turned in. What a blessing. We appreciate it. Lord bless. Have a great rest of the day.